My name's Jeremy Ryan. I've been the technical manager at KobaltMusic.com for about a year, which is long enough to get a reasonable overview of our architecture, and short enough that I've only just glimpsed the horror that is the music business. It works entirely upside down from how I thought it did. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The title of my talk is One Direction. I can't promise this will be the last awful music-related gag in this talk. It's from a quote from a Martin Fowler article about Monolith First, which again I'll quote later on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are at Kobalt Music, what we do, and how that's led to our current architecture, where we want to be, and I'm sure it's not spoilers to reveal that it's basically microservices. When we decided we should start chopping it up, how to start chopping it up, and whereabouts we are in the process right now. So, who we are, we basically do stuff in the music business. We're trying to make the music business work more transparently and quicker and more profitably for artists and songwriters. But we do four main things. So if you're an artist or a songwriter and you want to get some help recording or distributing or marketing your music, you need a record label, or at least someone who can provide at least one of those services. Maybe you're doing your own marketing or distribution or whatever. You want help getting your stuff onto iTunes or Spotify. We can do that. We also have a collection society called AMRA, who are the American Music Rights Association, which is a sister company. It's a separate company for legal reasons. And collection societies are more or less the first link in the chain between the people who've played your songs and hence owe you money, and all the people in the chain, and there are quite a lot of people in the chain, all taking a cut somewhere along the line until finally it gets back to the songwriter, who gets some of that money. Our collection society is digital only. So we only deal with streaming and downloads from places like Google Play and iTunes and Spotify and so on. But we're banking on the future being digital rather than CDs. Can I have a quick show of hands? Anybody who's bought a CD in 2017? More than I thought. More than I thought, I have to admit. I mean, some people still do, but I'm banking that probably it's going to be less and less, and that will be a smaller number if I asked in 2018. The lion's share of what we do is music publishing. And I'll talk a little bit about neighbouring rights is similar, but related. Music publishing is essentially getting money for the songwriter or artist when anybody plays or records or sells a recording of one of their songs or an album. It doesn't work the way I thought it did. I had it in my head that there would be this very sort of honourable, gentlemanly agreement where someone like iTunes would sell somebody's song and then they'd turn around to the collection society and say, here, we've sold this song, have some money. And they would turn around to the music publisher and say, hey, we've just got some money for one of your songs, here, have some of this money. And so on down the chain until finally some of it arrives at the artist. But actually it's entirely the other way around. People who sold it do pay the collection society, but everything after that, you have to ask, you have to pull for it, you have to say, these are our songs, do you owe us any money? And they'll go, well, we might, how much? And we'll say, well, we control 50% of this song. And they'll say, okay, they'll give us 50% of that money. Or they might say, well, we'll say, you owe us 60% of this song. And they'll say, no, you can't. They also say that we owe them 60% of this song, and so it gets incredibly complicated, and legal things happen that make it a nightmare. And eventually, that money will make it back to the songwriter or artist. And this process has been going on since people were recording it on parchment with quill pens in massive ledgers. Predates recording technology. And as recording became available, more different rights, so recording rights and performing rights and all sorts of things had to be catered for. And there are still, amazingly, people doing this stuff on paper, which blows my mind, because in March, we processed something like 500 million royalty payments. And to think of doing that on paper, or even in Excel, frankly, is just insane. And neighbouring rights are something similar. So neighbouring rights are to do with the money you are owed or may be owed if you played the triangle on somebody's record. If you just performed on it, you may be owed money. The rules as to whether or not you are owed money and how much are relatively arcane, but our system will deal with that for you. So, jumping ahead slightly. If we had to keep track of all that stuff on paper, it would just drive us nuts. So Willard Ardwitz, our founder, decided that the only way you can really cope with that kind of scale, the only way you can cope with that volume of data, is by throwing it all into a database. Which leads us neatly to our monolithic architecture. We have a honking great Oracle database with a Java Swing UI. Hands up, anybody use Java Swing? Again, more than I thought. We're talking to the database through a Tomcat server. Our internal users, so for example, the office staff and anybody who works for Kobalt will be using that. External users, like other music publishers or agents or artists even, will use an external web UI that's basically the other half of the tech team. I work on this side of it. And we also have a mobile app for artists to be able to look at and say, for example, how well is my song selling in Denmark, for example. And they can get all sorts of useful information about how much they've sold various songs in different territories, and it's quite useful for tour planning and that kind of stuff. But this is a monolith. It is a monolith. We realized it's a monolith, but that's not too bad. We kind of accepted that, and it scales reasonably well so far. Oracle is one of the things that you can sort of just throw money at it, and it will scale, but that kind of rises exponentially the more you want it to scale, unfortunately. And we've reached a point now where we're looking at it and thinking, well, yeah, it'll scale for the foreseeable future, but we can see in the distance that there will come a point where we won't be able to afford to scale it like that anymore. So we'll need to chop it up. So, where we want to be. Now, we want basically smaller services. Ideally microservices. Some of them will be easy to chop up into microservices, I'm fairly sure, but we would settle at the moment for smaller services. Because at the moment we just have one monolithic thing that is quite hard to scale in terms of the number of developers working on it. We do a release every week, and there may be, 100 issues fixed in that release, and if even one of the integration tests fails, it doesn't go out, or at least it doesn't go out until that's fixed. And if we've got something in the region of 80 developers, that's kind of doable. We're looking to add another 80 or 90 developers, at which point it will start becoming more and more problematic, as there will be at least double the number of bugs going into it, I'm fairly sure. And so we want to be able to deploy individual bits. We want the benefits that microservices will hopefully bring us. Now, stops along the way. This is what we have currently, something monolithic. Our first pass will hopefully give us something a little smaller. And eventually we'll end up with microservices, some services, and there's bound to be some things, I'm fairly sure, that won't be able to chop them up. They won't be able to be made into small, neat, easily deployable services. And maybe we'll be lucky, you never know. But I bet we don't. So the real question is, when do we start chopping it up? And I suppose the question really is, or the answer really is, when things start to bite us. We've got two real problems, which I've touched on. And so far we're getting, we're fine with them. We can cope. We have a manageable number of developers, and we release on time every week, and we're getting away with it. And we can cope with that. The other problem is scaling the database itself. And again, I said we can cope with what we've got. We've just invested quite heavily in some bigger Oracle hardware, and that's keeping us going. We can see that will keep us going for a good few years, but there will come a time when it won't. And we'd like to start this process before that happens. If we wait until it starts to bite, then that's probably too late, given how long it's going to take us to change it. So the other question is, how do you start? How do you start chopping up a monolith into a smaller set of services? Well, we're aiming to start with the easy stuff. Now, by easy, I mean stuff, you can look at your application and see, hopefully, some nice seams down which you can cut. We also have stuff that we've realized doesn't necessarily need to be live. I mean, nearly everything we've got at the moment looks directly at this live Oracle database. And so everything that customers see, everything we see internally, is up to the minute live. But not everything needs to be. I mean, typically when someone like, I don't know, somebody, if you would play a song on Spotify and you stream, I don't know, Foo Fighters song, they might not see the money for that. At the moment, the way the music business currently works, it can be anything up to 2 years for that money you owe Spotify or have paid Spotify makes its way back to Foo Fighters, which is insane. And they eventually, I mean, perhaps they're a bad example, but the typical artist gets a check at the end of that period with just a figure on it. And they don't know where that came from. They don't know how much of it came from your streaming of it on Spotify. So we're trying to make that a bit shorter, and pretty much the only way we can do that is if we can cut down the number of steps involved in that chain of people using our collection society, which we can talk to customers all over the world rather than having to have one collection society in Brazil, talking to a collection society in America, talking to a collection society in the UK, and finally going back to whatever artist. Where was I going with this? So yeah, we have a problem with scaling the Oracle DB. So we want to chop that up. We're starting with easy stuff. We are looking for the seams in our application where we can start cutting. We also want to make sure that there's stuff that doesn't need to be live. So, for example, that's where I was going with this. The web portal doesn't need to show live data. If they've been waiting 2 years up till now before they can see where all this information was coming from, they can wait another 2 hours. It doesn't have to be perfectly live. So that's where we started. I'll come to exactly how we've done that in a minute. The other thing is don't try to do everything at once. If we had to go from this straight to this, we would almost certainly fail. Or it would take an inordinately long time. Probably too long. So we're aiming to try and chop it up into slightly smaller services, and then take one of those and chop it up into even more slightly smaller services until we've got as close to a microservice architecture as we can find. But we're also aware that we haven't done this before, and so we have a plan, but no plan survives contact with the enemy for very long. So we know roughly where we want to get to, we know vaguely how we're going to get to it, but we're prepared to say, well, actually we're going to go a different way. And the last thing we have to make sure is we get our testing correct. How many people, show of hands, would say that they have enough test coverage? Again, more than I thought. Our test coverage is pretty good, actually. But it takes quite a long time to run any of the tests. We want to make that shorter so people can run them more often, and so we can know quicker when we've broken something. Because if we're going to start chopping it up, we need to know if we've broken something along the way before people get too far down that road. And at the moment, it takes half an hour for the test to run, hour and a half, something like that, somewhere in between. And we want to get that down to 2-3 minutes, ideally. So where are we now? Well, as I say, we're looking at those seams in our application, trying to figure out which bits we can just neatly hive off and have on their own. There are a few other than the web project, the web portal, but that's the main one we're looking at. So we're finding and doing the easy stuff, and the web guys will kill me for calling it easy. It's not easy at all, but it's the easiest to identify as a thing that we can hive off. It doesn't have to be live. It can look at a cached database. It doesn't have to necessarily be looking at the very, very busy Oracle database. And so they've started doing exactly that. They've got it more or less componentized. Some of the services are small enough to qualify as microservices. Quite a lot of them aren't. And they're now going through the process of saying, well, do we need to chop it up any smaller? It's like Michael said. You don't necessarily have to have microservices if they're small enough. Don't mind paraphrasing slightly. So we're looking for those sort of things. New projects, any new projects that come along, we're basically trying to steer them away from pointing at the database. We're trying to make sure that they are service-oriented and that those services are as small and focused on a particular task as possible. And the last thing we're doing is hiring experienced architects, because I think there's one guy in the web team who has done microservice projects before, but pretty much nobody else has. So we need to hire those kind of people. And I mean, where are you going to find those sort of people?